My name is Sarah, and I was an ER nurse for 35 years. I've seen the moment life leaves a person's eyes more times than I can count, but I'd never seen it happen to someone who was still breathing until that Tuesday afternoon in our living room. My son, Leo, slid a thick stack of papers across the oak coffee table, the one my husband Frank had built with his own 2 hands. The document landed with a soft, final thud. "It's just a signature, Dad," Leo said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "It gives me power of attorney, in case something happens." Frank, a retired fire captain who'd faced down 100-foot flames without flinching, just stared at the papers. He didn't move a muscle, but I could feel the coiled tension in him, the quiet refusal of a man who has been in control his entire life and has no intention of giving it up. "We're perfectly healthy, Leo," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Leo finally turned to look at me, and that's when I saw it. The warmth was gone. The boy I'd raised had been replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. "For now," he said, holding my gaze. "This is about protecting you. Protecting your legacy." The way he said legacy made my blood run cold. He wasn't talking about our love or our memories. He was talking about our property, our life's work. But that explosion was just the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for 25 years, ever since the day we lost our first son. Our first son, Ethan, was a force of nature. He was the kind of boy who was born with the sun in his pocket and adventure in his bones. He had Frank's quiet strength and my curiosity, and he used it to climb mountains, both real and metaphorical. When we lost him, the light in our world didn't just dim, it went out, leaving us with a silence that ached more than any sound. Leo, our younger son, was different. He was quieter, more watchful. After Ethan was gone, he stepped into the space his brother left behind, and for years, Frank and I convinced ourselves that his quietness was just a different kind of strength. We told ourselves that we were lucky to have one son left to build a life around. We were wrong. It wasn't a life he was building. It was a long, patient siege. The foundation that crumbled had been laid down over 40 years, with our own 4 hands, on the shore of a lake in the Pacific Northwest. We bought the property with every penny we'd saved from Frank's first few years at the fire department and my long shifts at the hospital. It was nothing back then, just a dilapidated one-room cabin and a tangle of blackberry bushes, but it had what Frank called good bones and a view that could heal a broken heart. He spent every day off for 30 years, turning that shack into a home. He raised the roof, put in skylights, and built a deck that hangs right over the water. I swear that man can speak to wood. He knows its language. My contribution was the earth. I tore out the thorns and planted a garden that exploded with life tomatoes, lavender, and roses so red they looked like they were bleeding color into the air. This place wasn't just a house. It was our fortress of solitude, our testament to a life of hard work. Frank retired as a captain, a man respected by everyone who ever served with him. He's a man of systems and rituals. Every morning he's up before the sun, walking the perimeter of our property, checking for fallen branches or signs of erosion along the shore. It's in his blood, the need to protect, to maintain order. He finds his peace in the doing of things, oiling the deck, sharpening his chainsaw, fixing the generator. I find my peace in the watching. As an ER nurse, my life was a blur of controlled chaos, of reading the subtle signs of distress in a person who couldn't speak. I learned to see the story behind the symptoms, and it's a habit I never broke. For a long time, our life felt like a quiet reward. Leo had married a girl from Seattle, Chloe, and they'd visit on weekends with our 2 grandkids. The house would fill with noise and laughter, and it almost felt whole again. Almost. But I started noticing things. Small things. The kind you'd dismiss if you weren't looking for them. Chloe would run her fingers along our granite countertops, the ones we'd saved up for 3 years to install after a particularly brutal wildfire season for Frank. "Is this quartzite or granite?" She'd ask, her voice bright and innocent. But her eyes weren't looking at the stone. They were calculating its value. Leo would stand on the deck with Frank, not looking at the sunset but at the neighboring properties, the new multi-million-dollar glass and steel monstrosities that were popping up like expensive weeds. "Wonder what a place like that goes for now," he'd muse, trying to sound casual. Frank, bless his heart, never saw it. He'd just grunt and say something about how you couldn't pay him to live in a glass box. He saw his son making conversation. I saw a man taking inventory. The heart of our property for me was always the boathouse, and inside, hanging from the rafters like a sacred relic, was Ethan's kayak. It was a beautiful thing, a strip-built cedar kayak that he and Frank had built together the summer he turned 16. I remember the smell of epoxy and sawdust, the sound of their quiet, contented work, the day they finally carried it to the water, as proud as if they had built the Taj Mahal. After Ethan died, Frank brought it back into the boathouse and hoisted it up into the shadows. It's been there ever since. Every spring, Frank gets on a ladder with a soft cloth and a can of special marine oil, and he carefully, lovingly, conditions the wood. He never says a word about it. He doesn't have to. It's a pilgrimage. A father's promise to never let his son's memory fade. Leo never went in the boathouse. Not once. The siege began in earnest about a year ago. It was the 4th of July, and we were having our annual BBQ. The whole family was there, the grandkids running through the sprinklers, the air thick with the smell of grilled burgers and fresh-cut grass. It was the picture of the American dream. Leo and Chloe cornered me by the dessert table while I was slicing up my signature cherry pie. "Sarah, you and Frank are amazing," Chloe started, laying it on thick. "I don't know how you keep this place up all by yourselves. It must be exhausting." I just smiled and handed her a slice. "It's a labor of love," I told her. Leo chimed in. "Yeah, but for how long? Our friends Mark and Jenny, their parents just sold their big house in Bellevue. Cashed out. They bought a gorgeous condo in Arizona, no maintenance, golf course, the works. They're living the good life." I placed the pie server down on the table. The small clink was the only sound in the little bubble they had created around me. It was the only protest I had in that moment. I looked at my son, at his eager, hungry face, and saw the salesman, not the son. It wasn't about us living the good life. It was about him getting his hands on ours. From that day on, it became a constant dripping faucet of suggestions. They'd send us listings for active senior living communities. They'd leave brochures for retirement homes on the kitchen counter. Every conversation was a carefully disguised interrogation about our finances, our health, our plans for the inevitable. They were trying to make us feel old. They were trying to make us feel incompetent. They were trying to erode our independence, the one thing Frank and I valued more than anything. We had never asked anyone for a handout in our lives. We'd worked, we'd saved, we'd built. The idea of giving up control, of letting someone else manage the life we had so carefully constructed, felt like a betrayal of everything we were. I'd watch Frank after they'd leave. He'd go out to his workshop, and I'd hear the roar of a power saw or the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane. It was his way of pushing back, of reinforcing the walls of his kingdom with sheer physical effort. But I could see the toll it was taking. I could see the worry etching new lines around his eyes. He was a man built to fight fires, not shadows. And my son, our only son, was casting the longest, darkest shadow of all. That shadow grew longer and darker as the summer wore on. It wasn't the kind of darkness that falls at night. It was the kind that seeps into the brightest afternoon, turning the sunlight cold. The brochures and the casual comments had just been them testing the waters. The real offensive began on Labor Day weekend, the last big hurrah before the Pacific Northwest settles into its long gray sleep. We were having the whole family over for a BBQ, a tradition as old as our mortgage. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and citronella, and the tiki torches we'd bought at Costco years ago were standing ready for nightfall. The grandkids were chasing each other with water guns, their shrieks of laughter echoing off the lake. It was by all accounts a perfect day. And perfect days are the best camouflage for an ambush. I was in my garden, pulling the last of the summer squash, when Chloe appeared at my elbow. She was holding 2 glasses of iced tea, a peace offering that felt more like a prop. "I just don't know how you do it, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet admiration. "This garden is like something out of a magazine. And the house, Frank takes such good care of it." I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my jeans. I knew this tone. It was the preamble to an attack. "We like to keep busy," I said, keeping my voice light. She handed me a glass, her manicured nails a bright artificial pink against the sweating glass. "But that's just it," she pressed on, her smile never wavering. "You shouldn't have to be this busy. People your age are supposed to be relaxing, enjoying their golden years, not restaining the deck every summer." I took a slow sip of the tea. It was too sweet. From the corner of my eye, I could see the boathouse, the dark opening like a mouth holding a secret. Ethan's kayak was in there, a monument to a time when a son's help was a gift, not a strategy. Your father-in-law enjoys the work, Chloe. It's who he is. She let out a little laugh, a sound like ice cubes clinking. Oh, I know, Frank's a rock, but even rocks get worn down by the water. And then Leo was there, suddenly appearing on her other side, a perfectly executed pincer movement. He put his arm around his wife, a picture of solidarity. Honey, you're going to worry, Mom, he said, but he was looking at me. We're just concerned, that's all. We see Dad up on that ladder cleaning the gutters, and we worry. The word worry was their weapon of choice. It was the perfect shield. How can you argue with someone who claims to be worried about you? It's meant to make you feel ungrateful, churlish. I could feel my jaw tighten. I wanted to tell him that his father had climbed taller ladders into burning buildings to carry children out, that cleaning gutters was something he could do in his sleep. I wanted to say that my hands, which had set bones and stitched wounds and held the hands of the dying, were more than capable of pulling up a few weeds. But I didn't. I just looked at my son, at the man he had become, and felt a profound, bottomless disappointment. Then Chloe delivered the killing blow, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were sharing a dreadful secret. Honestly, Sarah, she said, leaning in, this place, it's a death trap for people your age. All these stairs, the uneven ground, the dock. What if one of you fell when you were here alone? No one would find you for hours. A death trap. She called our home, the place where I had raised my children, the sanctuary Frank had built with his bare hands. A death trap. For a split second, the calm I had cultivated over a lifetime in the ER vanished. The garden trowel in my hand felt heavy, and a hot white flash of anger pulsed behind my eyes. I pictured myself flinging the overly sweet iced tea right into her perfectly made-up face, but I didn't. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, the cheerful sounds of the party suddenly seeming a million miles away. What did you just say? The voice was low and gravelly. It was Frank. He had come up behind them, silent as smoke. He was holding a metal spatula, and the smell of sizzling hot dogs clung to him like a cologne. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were locked on Chloe. She stammered, her practiced composure instantly gone. Oh, Frank, I just meant, we worry. Leo jumped in to save her, his voice placating. Dad, come on, she didn't mean anything by it. It's a figure of speech. Frank took a step closer, and for the first time, I saw my son and his wife look physically intimidated by him. He wasn't a big man, but a lifetime of command had given him a presence that could fill a room, or in this case, a whole backyard. This house stood through the '93 windstorm and the '01 earthquake, he said, his voice flat and hard. It'll stand long after we're gone. The hot dogs are ready. He turned, without waiting for a reply, and walked back to the grill. The dismissal was absolute. It was an iron door slamming shut. The rest of the party was a performance. Leo and Chloe were overly cheerful, playing with the kids, laughing too loudly at a neighbor's bad joke. But they were beaten, for now. They packed up their kids just as the sun began to set, leaving a trail of half-eaten potato salad and plastic cups in their wake. As their SUV pulled out of the driveway, Frank and I stood on the porch, not speaking. The silence they left behind was louder than the party had been. He finally sighed, the sound seeming to carry all the weariness of the world. He put his arm around me, and we just stood there, watching the last of the sunlight bleed from the sky. A death trap, he finally murmured, shaking his head. I leaned into him, drawing on his strength. They're getting impatient, Frank, I whispered. He didn't answer. He just squeezed my shoulder, his grip tight, and we both looked out at the dark, quiet lake, the surface as smooth as glass, hiding whatever lay in the depths below. The depths, I was learning, were not just in the lake. They were in the silences between Frank and me, in the 25 years of unspoken words that had settled at the bottom of our marriage. After that disastrous Labor Day BBQ, a heavy quiet fell over the house. Leo and Chloe stayed away, a tactic meant to make us feel their disapproval, to make us miss them and reconsider their helpful suggestions. But instead of loneliness, I felt a strange sense of clarity, the kind you get after a high fever breaks. The enemy had shown his face. The shadows now had a name. And for the first time in a long time, I knew we had a fight on our hands. Frank retreated to his workshop, his sanctuary. I'd hear the hum of the lathe or the sharp crack of a splitting maul from dawn until dusk. It was his way of processing, of turning his anxiety into something tangible and useful. I needed my own way. One morning, after watching him stalk out to the workshop with his jaw set, I decided I couldn't just watch anymore. I put on my old work clothes and marched out there. He was at his workbench, meticulously sharpening a chisel, his back to me. "I'm going to clean this place out," I announced. "It's a fire hazard." He didn't turn around, but the rhythmic scrape of the stone stopped. That was his version of a conversation. It meant, "Go on. I'm serious, Frank." Oily rags, piles of sawdust, 50 years of junk. It's time. He was silent for a long moment, then he placed the chisel down. "Knock yourself out," he said, and went back to his work. Frank's workshop is a map of his mind. It's organized chaos, but to him, every screw, every stray piece of lumber, every half-empty can of varnish has its place. It smells of cedar shavings and motor oil and the faint, metallic scent of cold steel, the smell of my husband. For me, cleaning it was an act of love, of putting his world in order so he could focus on the real mess. I spent the day sweeping, sorting, and organizing. I filled boxes for Goodwill and bags with trash. It felt good to be productive, to fight back against the feeling of helplessness that had been creeping in. Late in the afternoon, covered in dust and sweat, I found it in the far corner, tucked under a heavy canvas tarp, a large military-style footlocker, stenciled with the name Miller. Ethan's old trunk. My breath caught in my throat. We hadn't opened it since the week after the funeral, when Frank had carried it out here, unable to look at it in his son's empty bedroom any longer. I ran my hand over the dusty lid, my fingers tracing the faded letters of our name. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. After a moment's hesitation, I undid the heavy brass latches. They groaned in protest. The air that escaped from the trunk was stale, a captured breath of a life cut short. Inside, neatly coiled like sleeping snakes, were his climbing ropes, his worn leather harness, his chalk bag, still holding a faint dusting of white powder. I lifted each item out, my hands trembling. They were ghosts, relics of a boy who believed he was invincible. And then I saw it. Tucked into a side pocket of the harness was a single carabiner. It was a heavy, pear-shaped locking carabiner, its anodized blue finish scarred with the silver marks of 100 adventures. I picked it up. It was cool and solid in my palm, a piece of equipment designed to hold a man's life, to be the one thing that stood between him and the abyss. I clicked the gate open and shut. The sound was crisp, perfect. And as I held it, the dusty, sun-drenched workshop faded away, and I was somewhere else entirely. I was 25 years younger, standing at the base of a granite cliff in the Cascades. The air was thin and sharp with the scent of pine. A teenage Ethan, all lanky limbs and confident energy, was showing Frank how to properly clip into an anchor. "You gotta hear the click, Dad," he was saying, his voice full of the easy patience of a natural teacher. "It's the sound of safety. Never trust it if you don't hear the click." He clipped the blue this carabiner onto Frank's harness. "And always screw the gate down. See? Screw down so you don't screw up. That's what they say." Frank, who was never comfortable with heights, looked nervous but proud. He fumbled with the locking gate, his big, calloused fingers clumsy compared to Ethan's nimble ones. "Like this?" he asked. Ethan grinned, a flash of pure, unadulterated joy. "Perfect. See? You're a natural. I'll have you on LCAP by next summer." He patted his father's shoulder, a gesture of absolute love and confidence. I remember taking a picture of that moment, the two of them against the vast, unforgiving rock, bound together by a rope and a small piece of blue metal. The memory was so vivid it hurt. I could almost feel the mountain sun on my face. When it faded, I was back in the workshop, my hand clenched around the carabiner. The joy of the memory was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I looked at the scratches on its surface, each one a story, each one a testament to a moment he had survived. Except for the last one. I remembered the official report. The lead anchor on his final climb had failed, equipment malfunction, a tragic, unavoidable accident. We had accepted it. How could we not? It was too horrible to question. But now, holding this solid, perfectly functional piece of his life in my hand, a new thought, ugly and unwelcome, began to surface. Ethan was meticulous. He was careful. He lived by the rules of the mountain because he respected its power. Screw down so you don't screw up. He would never have made a mistake like that. It just wasn't possible. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I looked around the workshop, at the tools hanging in their perfect order on the pegboard, at the neatly stacked lumber, at the evidence of a man who believed in precision, in safety, in doing things the right way. Frank had taught Ethan all of that, and Ethan had lived it. So what really happened on that mountain? What was the one variable in that perfect system of safety and preparation that could have caused it all to fail? I stood there in the quiet of my husband's workshop, with the ghost of one son in my hand, and for the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question I had buried for 25 years. The question that was suddenly, terrifyingly, connected to the shadow of the other. That small blue piece of metal felt as heavy as a tombstone in my hand. I carried it from the workshop back into the house, the question it had unearthed screaming in my mind. The sun was setting, and the sky to the west was bruised with the dark purple and gray of an approaching storm. Frank was in the living room, sitting in his old leather armchair, staring out the window at the churning lake. He wasn't seeing the view. He was a million miles away. I walked over and stood in front of him, blocking his line of sight. He looked up, his eyes weary. I opened my hand and placed the carabiner on the small table beside him. It made a soft metallic click against the wood, a sound as sharp and final as a closing latch. Ethan was careful, Frank, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. He was meticulous. He would have checked his gear. He would have heard the click. He would have screwed the gate down. Frank's eyes flickered to the carabiner for a fraction of a second before he looked away, back out the window at the darkening water. "It was an accident, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The report said—" "I don't care what the report said!" My voice cracked, the control I prided myself on finally snapping. "I'm asking you. You taught him. You know how he was. Was it possible for him to make a mistake like that?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the lake, his jaw set like granite. The wind began to howl outside, rattling the windows in their frames. It sounded like a woman weeping. "Why won't you look at it?" I pressed, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Why won't you talk about him? It's been 25 years, and you act like he never existed. You oil his kayak, you sharpen his tools, but you never, ever say his name." I was circling him now, a prosecutor in my own living room. And now Leo. Leo and his wife are circling this house like vultures, calling it a death trap, pushing us to sign our lives over to them. Don't you see it? Don't you see that it's all connected somehow? "You're not being rational," he shot back, his voice rough with an anger I knew was just a shield for something else. "You're mixing up your grief with what's happening now. Leo is being foolish, but he's not." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "He's not what, Frank?" I stopped in front of him again, forcing him to meet my eyes. "He's not a monster? Are you sure about that? Because I see a coldness in him that scares me to death. And it's the same coldness I remember from the day of Ethan's funeral. While I was falling apart, he was just calm. He was watchful. The first fat drops of rain began to hit the window panes, thick and heavy like tears. A low roll of thunder echoed from across the lake. Frank finally stood up, his big frame seeming to shrink in on itself. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "Stop it, Sarah. Just stop. You're tearing open old wounds for no reason." "No," I said, my voice shaking with a quarter-century of repressed sorrow and a brand-new terrifying suspicion. "The wound never healed. You just put a bandage on it and pretended it wasn't there. I want to know what you buried under that bandage, Frank. I have a right to know." I was his mother. That was what broke him. The word mother. As if it was a key that unlocked the vault of his guilt. The sky outside cracked open. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room, and in that stark white light, I saw the truth on his face. His tough, firefighter's facade crumbled, and he was just an old man, haunted and broken. A deafening clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations, and as the sound faded, he sank back into his chair and finally began to talk. The words came out in a torrent, a flash flood of guilt held back for a lifetime. "Ethan found out," he began, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the drumming of the rain. "He came to me a few days before the trip. He'd found bank statements, credit card bills. Leo was in deep, gambling debts. Over $100,000 to some very bad people in the city. I gripped the back of the sofa to keep from falling, the room tilting around me. Leo had been stealing from our savings account. Small amounts at first, then bigger. Ethan had been tracking it for months. He was going to confront him. He was going to tell us. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the world outside into a gray watercolor of misery. I told him to wait. Frank choked out. Tears he'd never shed at the funeral now streaming down his face. I told him we'd handle it as a family, but he was so angry, so disappointed in his brother. He went to meet Leo at the trailhead that morning to talk before the climb. Frank's head fell into his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. I had a bad feeling. I followed them. I was late, maybe 15 minutes late. By the time I got to the base of the climb, Ethan was already on the ground. The air left my lungs. I couldn't breathe. And Leo? I whispered. Leo was there, he said, looking up at me, his eyes pleading for an absolution I could not give him. He was hysterical. Crying. He said they'd argued. He said Ethan had called him a disgrace. He said in a fit of anger, he just unscrewed the gate on his brother's main carabiner while Ethan wasn't looking. He said he never thought Ethan would fall. He just wanted to scare him, to teach him a lesson for interfering. The lie was so pathetic, so transparently evil, that a wave of nausea washed over me. And you believed him, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of my own damnation. He was my son, Sarah, he cried out, his voice a raw wound. Our son, he was all we had left. He was on his knees begging me. He said it was an accident, a stupid, horrible mistake. I looked at Ethan, and he was gone. I couldn't bring him back. I thought I could save the one I had left. So he did. He made a choice. He chose the living son over the dead one. He chose the lie over the truth. He helped Leo concoct the story of equipment failure. He called 911. He coached a murderer on how to cry. And for 25 years, he let me grieve for an accident that never happened. He let me live a lie. The storm raged on outside, a wild symphony of our shattered life. I looked at my husband, the man I had loved and trusted for 45 years, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty canyon of betrayal. Then I looked at the small, blue carabiner still sitting on the table, a silent witness to it all. It wasn't a symbol of a tragic accident, it was a murder weapon. And the ghost in our house wasn't Ethan. It was the truth. The truth didn't set us free. It caged us. For the rest of that long, storm-tossed night, Frank and I sat in the ruins of our life, the silence between us more violent than any thunder. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 45 years and saw a stranger, a co-conspirator in the destruction of our family. The betrayal was a physical thing, a shard of ice in my heart. Every memory we shared was now tainted, every happy moment a scene from a well-acted play. My grief was absolute. But as the storm outside exhausted itself and the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the windows, something else rose through the wreckage of my heart. Rage. A cold, clear, and focused rage. I had spent my career in the ER, a place where you don't have time for hysterics. You assess the damage, you stop the bleeding, you stabilize the patient, and you act. You build a wall between your emotions and the job that needs to be done. And as the sun came up on our shattered world, I felt that old familiar switch flip inside me. Frank was still in his chair, a slumped, broken figure. He hadn't slept. He looked 100 years old. The anger I felt toward him was still there, a white-hot coal in my gut. But I also knew, with the chilling pragmatism of a triage nurse, that he was the only other person in this world who understood the full extent of the threat. The murderer our son had become was a problem. And you don't cry about a problem, you solve it. I got up and walked to the kitchen, my movements stiff. I made coffee, the familiar, mundane ritual, a small anchor in the chaos. The smell of it filled the house, a scent of normalcy that was a lie. I brought a mug to Frank and set it on the table beside him. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a shame so profound I almost looked away. Sarah, he started. I held up a hand, cutting him off. Not now, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. We can fall apart later. Right now, you're not my husband. You're a fire captain. And I'm not your wife. I'm a nurse. And we have a patient who is trying to kill us. "So you are going to tell me, from a tactical perspective, what he is going to do next." The change in him was instantaneous. It was like I had given him a direct order, a familiar command that cut through the fog of his guilt. He sat up straighter. The broken old man receded, and a flicker of the captain I once knew returned. He picked up the coffee mug, his hands still trembling slightly, but his eyes were clear, focused. "The property," he said, his voice raspy. "It's all he wants. He's tried manipulation. He's tried wearing us down. It's not working fast enough. His debts. Whatever situation he was in 25 years ago, it's happening again, but worse. He's desperate. So he'll accelerate the plan," I said, finishing his thought. "He'll create a situation where our deaths look like another tragic, unavoidable accident." He nodded, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward the lake. "The boat," he said. "It's the perfect place. It's isolated. The water is deep and cold. He'll get us out in the middle of the lake, disable the engine, and capsize it. Hypothermia. Drowning. Two old folks who had no business being out on the water alone. It's clean." A chill went through me, but I didn't let it show. This was a diagnosis. Now we needed a treatment plan. "Okay," I said, pulling a chair up to face him. The kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals became our command center, so we don't go on the boat. "No," he said, shaking his head, and for the first time a spark of the old strategic Frank was there. "No, we go. It's the only way. If we refuse, he'll find another way. A fire in the house while we sleep. A brake line cut on the car. On the boat, on our boat. We know the territory. We can set the terms." And that's how the counter-sting was born. Not in a blaze of vengeful glory, but in the quiet, grim light of morning, over coffee, with the wreckage of our past all around us. For the next 2 days we became a two-person tactical unit. The wall of betrayal between us didn't vanish, but we built a bridge of necessity across it. He was the strategist, I was logistics. He pulled out nautical charts of the lake, spreading them across the table. He pointed out the dead zones for cell reception, the prevailing wind directions, the areas with the fastest currents. He was assessing the battlefield. I went to work in my own way. I dug out the waterproof phone pouches we used for kayaking. I found the old first aid kit from our hiking days and began to modify it, creating a survivor's kit. I vacuum-sealed a Mylar emergency blanket, a small signal mirror, and a waterproof lighter. The most important piece of gear came from Frank's past. He went into his workshop and came back with a small orange device, a personal locator beacon. "It was part of my old search and rescue pack," he explained, turning it over in his hands. "When you activate it, it sends a distress signal with your exact GPS coordinates directly to the county sheriff's rescue division. It bypasses the 911 system. They don't call you back, they just come." Hope, cold and sharp, pierced through my anger for the first time. We had a weapon. We rehearsed the plan over and over, what we would say, how we would act, how to fake the initial stages of hypothermia, how to use the capsized boat as a life raft. He taught me a specific rescue swimmer's technique for conserving energy in cold water. I taught him how to create a makeshift splint and how to convincingly mimic the signs of a concussion. We were no longer grieving parents. We were soldiers preparing for a war we never asked for, but one we were determined to win. On the third day, the phone rang. It was Leo, his voice full of a false, cheerful warmth. He wanted to take us out on the boat that weekend, a special trip, just the four of us, to celebrate our anniversary, to clear the air after the unpleasantness at the BBQ. It was the invitation we had been waiting for. I looked at Frank across the kitchen. He gave me a single, slow nod. The captain was back on duty. "That sounds lovely, son," I said into the phone, my voice as sweet as poison. "We'd love to go." When I hung up, I stood by the window and looked out at Ethan's kayak, still hanging in the boathouse. We weren't just doing this for us, we were doing it for him. We were going to finish the job our son had started 25 years ago. We were going to expose the truth. This time, there would be no secrets buried in the depths. This time, there would be no secrets buried in the depths. There would only be a reckoning. The 3 days leading up to the boat trip were the longest of my life. We moved through our home like actors on a stage, playing the part of a healing family for an audience of one, our son. We spoke to him on the phone, our voices carefully modulated to sound forgiving and hopeful. We discussed what food to bring, what time to leave. Every word was a lie, a carefully placed stepping stone leading him toward our trap. The betrayal I felt toward Frank hadn't vanished, but it had transmuted into something else, a shared, grim purpose. We were a unit again, bound not by the vows we'd made 45 years ago, but by a new, unspoken one. We would see this through, together. Saturday dawned unnaturally bright and clear, the sky a vast, indifferent blue. The lake was calm, its surface like a polished mirror, reflecting the perfect autumn day. It felt like the world was mocking us, setting a beautiful scene for a monstrous act. While the coffee brewed, I went into the bathroom. I took the small orange locator beacon and used waterproof medical tape to secure it to my ribs, just under my bra line. It was cold against my skin, a small, hard promise of rescue. I pulled my thick wool sweater over it, checking in the mirror to make sure no telltale bulge gave it away. Frank came into the kitchen as I was packing a small dry bag. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just silently handed me 2 phones, each one sealed inside a heavy-duty waterproof pouch. I tucked them into the bag along with the Mylar blanket and the signal mirror. We were no longer packing for a picnic. We were assembling a go bag. When Leo and Chloe's car crunched up the gravel driveway, my heart gave a hard, painful lurch. This was it. The performance began. I opened the door with a wide, welcoming smile plastered on my face. Frank came up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder in a show of solidarity that was both a complete fiction and the truest thing in the world. Leo was beaming, looking handsome and carefree. Chloe was holding a large picnic basket, her own smile looking a little brittle around the edges. "We brought lunch," she announced, her voice a little too loud. "And I made my special hot chocolate in a thermos to keep us warm." My mind instantly went to the worst places. Was it drugged? A sedative to make the drowning go more smoothly? I met Frank's eyes over her head. His expression was placid, but I saw his almost imperceptible nod. We anticipated this. Stick to the plan. "How wonderful, dear," I said, taking the heavy basket from her. "Frank, why don't you help Leo with the cooler down at the dock?" The walk down to the water was the longest of my life. Our path took us right past the boathouse. The big sliding door was open a few feet, and inside I could see the graceful curve of Ethan's cedar kayak hanging in the shadows. It was a silent accusation, a testament to a brother's love that had been answered with murder. Leo's gaze slid past the opening without a flicker of recognition. It was just a building to him, a shed, but I looked at it and I drew strength from it. This wasn't just about Frank and me. It was about honoring the memory of the son who had built things, not destroyed them. I felt a wave of cold resolve wash over me, extinguishing the last of my fear. Leo's boat was tied to the end of our dock, a stark contrast to Frank's old, reliable aluminum fishing boat. It was a sleek new fiberglass thing, far too expensive for a man we now knew was drowning in debt. It was a boat bought with lies, and it was meant to be the stage for our murder. We all climbed aboard, the boat rocking gently. Chloe immediately began fussing, laying out blankets on the seats, offering everyone snacks. She was playing the perfect hostess. Frank took his place near the stern, his movements casual as he checked the location of the fire extinguisher and the extra life vests. He was assessing the scene, just as he would have at a fire, noting exits, hazards, and resources. I took a seat in the bow, the dry bag containing our secrets tucked safely at my feet. As Leo piloted the boat away from the shore, the conversation was painfully normal. They asked about our neighbors. We asked about the grandkids' school pictures. We were 4 strangers performing a play about a happy family. My senses were on high alert. I felt the cold spray on my face as we picked up speed. I listened to the steady drone of the powerful engine. I watched the shoreline of our home, our fortress, recede into the distance, leaving us isolated in the vast expanse of water and sky. Chloe poured her special hot chocolate into mugs. When she handed one to me, I wrapped my hands around it, letting its warmth seep into my fingers. Smells delicious," I said, bringing it to my lips. As she turned to talk to Frank, I tilted the mug, pouring a small amount of the dark liquid over the side of the boat, unseen. I would not let my guard down. Not for a second. We cruised for what felt like an eternity. Leo was taking us to the middle of the lake, to a spot Frank had pointed out on the map, the deepest part, with the worst cell reception. "What a perfect day for this," Leo shouted over the engine. "I'm so glad we could all get together and clear the air." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "So are we, son," Frank called back, his voice steady. He caught my eye and gave me another tiny nod. Almost time. I could feel the beacon pressed against my ribs, a cold, hard secret. I rested my hand on the dry bag at my feet. My heart wasn't pounding anymore. It was slow, steady, and ready. I was an ER nurse. I had faced down death 1,000 times. I would not let it win today. Then, it happened. Leo slowed the boat, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the hull. The shore was a distant, hazy line in every direction. We were utterly alone. Huh, Leo said, frowning at the console. That's weird. Sounds like we're having engine trouble. He looked back at Frank, a look of faux concern on his face. Dad, can you come take a look? You know a lot more about these things than I do. This was the moment, the beginning of the end. Frank stood up slowly. I saw him brace his feet, saw the muscles in his back tense under his jacket. I looked at my son, the murderer of his brother, the architect of our doom, and I smiled. Of course, dear, I said. Your father can fix anything. Your father can fix anything. The words hung in the air, a perfect, gleaming lie. Frank moved toward the stern, his steps deliberate and steady on the rocking deck. He was playing the part of the concerned father, the competent handyman. But I saw the truth. I saw the way he shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, the way he kept his center of gravity low. He wasn't walking like a retiree. He was moving like a firefighter approaching a dangerous scene, anticipating the flashover. Leo watched him, a predator's stillness in his eyes. He had his hand on the throttle, his knuckles white. Chloe was fussing with the picnic basket, her movements jerky and unnatural, a terrible actress in the final scene of a tragedy. Let me see, Frank said, his voice calm as he knelt by the outboard motor. He put his hand on the engine cover, feigning a look of concentration. Might have just flooded it. Maybe you should lean out a bit, Dad, Leo said, his voice tight. See if the prop is fouled. That was the signal, the cue for the attack. I braced myself, my hand gripping the dry bag at my feet. The air was suddenly thin, the silence on the lake vast and absolute. It was the quiet of a held breath, the quiet before the scream. And then, instead of a push, Leo did something I hadn't expected. He jammed the throttle forward. The engine, which had supposedly been dead, roared to life with a gut-wrenching snarl. The boat didn't move forward. It lunged violently to the side, directly toward a dark shape I now saw lurking just beneath the surface, a deadhead log, a massive, waterlogged tree trunk, as hard and unforgiving as a concrete pylon. It was his cover story. The manufactured accident. The boat wasn't just going to capsize, it was going to be damaged, wrecked, providing a plausible reason for our deaths. The impact was a brutal full-body concussion. The sound was a sickening crack of splintering fiberglass, a sound that went right through my bones. Frank was thrown against the motor, and I was pitched forward, my head narrowly missing a metal cleat. Chloe shrieked, a genuine sound of terror, this time the amateur caught in the professional's crossfire. Oh my God, Leo screamed, his performance starting. We hit something. Dad, are you okay? In that split second of chaos, he moved. While Frank was still reeling from the impact, Leo lunged. It wasn't a frantic push. It was a single, brutally efficient shove, aimed at Frank's center of mass. It was the calculated application of force, a murderer's cold physics. I saw Frank's eyes widen, not in surprise but in a grim acknowledgement. So this is it. He didn't fight to stay in the boat. He used Leo's momentum, twisting as he went over the side, a dark shape disappearing into the green water with a heavy splash. Frank! I screamed, my voice raw. Chloe was wailing, clinging to a seat. Leo, what are you doing? Help him! But Leo wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at me. His face was a mask of feral triumph. The play was over. It's a tragedy, he said, his voice chillingly calm. A terrible accident. He took a step toward me, but the damage he had done to his own boat was his undoing. The impact had punched a hole below the waterline, and the lake was pouring in. The boat, already unstable from Frank's weight going over one side, gave a violent lurch. The world tilted at a sickening angle. The cooler, the picnic basket, Chloe's designer purse, everything slid across the deck in an avalanche of debris. I didn't wait for him to reach me. I threw myself backward, toward the rising side of the boat, clutching my dry bag. I heard Chloe's scream cut short as a wave of icy water washed over the side, engulfing her. Then the sky was gone. The world was a churning, green-black chaos of bubbles and freezing cold. The shock of the water was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My life as an ER nurse had taught me one thing above all else. In a crisis, panic is a luxury you cannot afford. My training kicked in, a calm, cold voice cutting through the terror. The surface has the air. Find the surface. I was upside down, disoriented. I let my body go limp for a second, feeling the natural pull of my life vest. I felt a tug upward. I kicked. My head broke the surface with a gasp. I coughed, spitting out a mouthful of acrid, gasoline-tinged lake water. The air was bitingly cold, but it was air. I was alive. The world was a wreck. The sleek, expensive boat was overturned, its white hull pointing to the sky like a tombstone. Chloe was clinging to the side, sobbing hysterically. And a few yards away, Frank was treading water, his face grim, his eyes already scanning, assessing. He was no longer a husband or a father. He was a first responder at a disaster scene. Then I saw Leo. He surfaced near Frank, his face a mask of fury. His plan had gone wrong. It was supposed to be clean, a simple capsize, but the violent collision, the rapid sinking it, had become chaotic, uncontrolled. He looked at Frank, his own father, treading water a few feet away, and there was no recognition in his eyes, only obstacle. "You were always so hard to get rid of," he snarled, the words cutting through the quiet. He lunged toward Frank, his hands outstretched, ready to finish the job his sabotage had started. The battle for our lives wasn't over. It had just moved to a new, more dangerous arena. The arena was a churning mess of freezing water and shattered plans. When Leo lunged at Frank, he wasn't attacking an old man. He was attacking a firefighter trained in water rescue, a man who had pulled panicked, thrashing people from submerged cars and raging rivers. Frank didn't meet his son's attack with fists. He met it with technique. As Leo's hands reached for his throat, Frank went under, using the water's own resistance to his advantage. He twisted, came up behind Leo, and in one smooth, brutally efficient motion, he wrapped his arm around our son's chest, pinning his arms. It was a textbook rescue hold, designed to control a drowning victim, and in that moment, that's exactly what Leo was. A man drowning in his own hate. "Stop fighting me, Leo," Frank grunted, his voice strained from the effort and the cold. "It's over." But Leo was a cornered animal. He thrashed and cursed, his rage a futile explosion against his father's practiced calm. "I'll kill you both," he screamed, his voice a raw, ugly sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the lake. Chloe was still clinging to the overturned hull, her sobs the only other sound. She was watching her future dissolve in the icy water, her accomplice neutralized, her perfect plan in ruins. This was my cue. All their attention was on the violent drama between father and son. No one was watching the weak, pathetic mother, shivering and barely able to stay afloat. It was the role I was born to play. My body was screaming from the shock of the cold, a deep, invasive ache that went straight to the bone, but the ER nurse in me had taken over. I knew I had about 20 minutes before hypothermia would become a real, unfakeable threat. The clock was ticking. I let my body go limp, my movements slow and weak, and I kicked just enough to propel myself toward the floating dry bag. I grabbed it, my fingers already clumsy and numb. "Frank, I'm so cold," I called out, my voice a pathetic, chattering whisper. Frank heard me. He risked a glance in my direction. "Just hold on, Sarah," he called back, his voice a commander's bark. "Hold on to the boat. It was our code, our signal. Do it now." I fumbled with the clasp on the bag, my numb fingers refusing to obey. For a terrifying second, I thought I was going to fail. "Come on, Sarah." I thought of Ethan. I thought of his confident smile on that mountain, his belief in safety, in doing things the right way. I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting for his. My fingers finally found their purchase, and I ripped the seal open. Inside, our 2 phones and the orange beacon were dry and safe. I ignored the phones for now. My target was the beacon. It was small, compact, with a single rubberized button protected by a plastic flip cover. I flipped the cover open with my thumb. This was the point of no return. I looked over at Leo. Frank still had him in the hold, but the fight was draining both of them. Chloe was just watching, paralyzed. They were so focused on their own survival, their own desperate struggle, that they had forgotten all about me. They had underestimated me my entire life. They saw a wife, a mother, a nurse. a caregiver. They never, ever saw a threat. I pressed the button. There was no sound, no flash of light. It was a silent cry for help, a signal launched into the empty sky, a prayer addressed to a satellite. For a moment, nothing happened. The world was just the four of us, adrift in the middle of a cold, lonely lake. Had it worked? Was anyone coming? The doubt was a fresh wave of ice in my veins. I turned my attention to my phone. My fingers were so cold I could barely operate the screen, but I managed to unlock it and open the audio file we had prepared. I was ready. Now, we just had to survive. "He's tiring," I called to Frank, my voice still weak, but a little stronger now. "Kick toward the boat. Both of you." Frank understood. He began to kick, towing a struggling, sputtering Leo with him. Chloe scrambled out of their way as they reached the hull. Frank shoved Leo up against the slick fiberglass. "You stay put," he ordered. The fight was over. Now, there was only the waiting. It was the worst part. The cold was real now, a crushing weight. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Chloe's sobs had subsided into whimpers. Leo was just glaring at Frank, his chest heaving, hate radiating off him in waves. And then I heard it, a faint, low hum, almost imperceptible at first, like the buzz of a distant insect. It grew steadily louder, resolving itself into the unmistakable thrum of a powerful engine. A boat. My heart leaped. I looked at Frank, and he was already scanning the horizon. He saw it first. A dark speck, growing larger by the second, throwing up a white wake behind it. "Help is coming!" Chloe cried, a surge of hysterical relief in her voice. Leo's face changed. The hate was replaced by a flicker of cunning. The performer was coming back. He was already crafting his story, preparing his role as the traumatized son, the grieving husband-to-be. He thought he was being rescued. He had no idea he was being captured. The boat was closer now, a big official-looking vessel from the county sheriff's department, its blue and red lights now flashing across the surface of the water. As it slowed, creating a wide, gentle circle around our little disaster scene, Frank gave me the signal, the one we had practiced. The one that meant, "Bring the thunder." I raised my phone from the water. I hit play. And in the sudden engine idling quiet of the lake, Frank's voice, clear, calm, and recorded, echoed from the phone's small speaker. "This is retired Captain Frank Miller. If you are hearing this, my son, Leo Miller, has just attempted to murder me and my wife, Sarah. He has deliberately wrecked this boat, and we are in the water at the following GPS coordinates." The effect was instantaneous. The 2 deputies on the bow of the rescue boat, who had been readying rescue lines, froze. Their hands went to their belts. Chloe's face, which had been alight with hope, crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. But the worst was Leo. He stared at the phone in my hand, then at his father, then back at the phone. The calculation in his eyes gave way to a dawning, panicked comprehension. The trap hadn't been his. It had been ours. The recording continued, Frank's voice narrating every detail of Leo's plan. But it didn't stop there. "This act," the recording of my husband's voice announced, its tone cold as the grave, "is a direct result of his desperation. The same desperation that led him to murder his brother Ethan Miller 25 years ago by sabotaging his climbing gear." At the mention of Ethan's name, a strangled, inhuman sound escaped Leo's throat. It was the sound of a monster seeing its own reflection for the very first time. The game was over. The truth was no longer in the depths. It was out in the open, playing on a cheap Bluetooth speaker, under a perfect blue sky for everyone to hear. The sound of Frank's recorded voice hung over the water like a judgment. For a long, stunned moment, the world was utterly silent except for the gentle lapping of the lake against the overturned hull and the quiet hum of the sheriff's boat engine. The 2 deputies on the bow looked from the phone in my hand to Leo, their expressions shifting from concern to a hard, professional neutrality. Their training took over. They were no longer rescuers. They were officers at a crime scene. Leo, who was still being held against the boat by Frank, seemed to deflate. The raw animal fury drained out of him, replaced by the bloodless, waxy look of a man who has just seen the gallows being built in his own backyard. Chloe was the first to break. The silence shattered as she let out a piercing, hysterical wail. "It wasn't me," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, water-wrinkled finger at her husband. "It was him. It was all him. He told me it was an investment plan. He told me you were sick. I didn't know anything about Ethan. I swear to God I didn't know. It was a pathetic, frantic scramble for the moral high ground, a rat deserting a sinking ship. Leo turned his head and looked at his wife, and the look on his face was one of pure, venomous disgust. The loving partnership, the unified front, it had all been a business arrangement, and the business had just gone bankrupt. The deputies were all motion now, their actions crisp and efficient. "We're bringing you all aboard," one of them said, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone that cut through Chloe's hysterics. "You two first," he said, pointing at Frank and me. They helped us onto the swim step of their boat, their hands gentle but firm. The moment I was out of the water, the cold hit me with a new, vicious intensity. My body was racked with a violent, uncontrollable shivering. A female deputy immediately wrapped me in a thick, rough wool blanket. It smelled of gasoline and dampness, but it was the most comforting thing I had ever felt. She did the same for Frank. We were the victims. We were being cared for. They sat us down, and another officer handed us steaming mugs of coffee from a thermos. The hot liquid scalded my throat, but it was a good pain, a pain that meant I was alive. From my seat, wrapped in my cocoon of wool, I watched them deal with the perpetrators. They pulled a sobbing Chloe from the water first. She continued to babble, a torrent of self-serving denials. "He's a monster. He lied to me about everything. You have to believe me." The deputies listened with blank, patient faces, the way you listen to a storm you just have to wait out. Then they pulled Leo aboard. He didn't struggle. All the fight was gone. He just moved like a man in a dream, his eyes empty and unfocused. They sat him and Chloe on the opposite side of the boat from us, a clear line of demarcation. The family was officially, irrevocably divided. As the boat powered up and sped toward the shore, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle on me. I watched my son, my only living child, shivering under an emergency blanket, his head bowed in defeat. There was no triumph in me, no rush of victory. There was only a vast, hollow ache. The ache of a mother who has just borne witness to the death of her own child's soul. Frank sat beside me, silent, his gaze fixed on the approaching shoreline. I knew he was feeling the same thing, but amplified by the crushing weight of his 25 years of guilt. He had tried to save this boy once by hiding the truth. Now, we had saved ourselves by exposing it. Our boat ramp was lit up like a crime scene on television. 2 patrol cars were parked, their lights painting the trees and the dark water in strobing flashes of red and blue. As we docked, 2 more officers came aboard. They helped Frank and me onto the solid ground of the dock. My legs were unsteady, and I leaned on Frank, not just for physical support, but for the silent strength that was now flowing between us again. We stood there, wrapped in our blankets, and watched as they escorted Leo and Chloe from the boat. They were separated immediately. One officer took a still sobbing Chloe to a patrol car. Another 2 flanked Leo. The lead deputy, a tall man with a kind but serious face, approached our son. "Leo Miller," he said, his voice formal, carrying in the quiet night air. "You have the right to remain silent." The words of the Miranda warning, so familiar from 1,000 movies and TV shows, were utterly surreal in this context. This wasn't a show. This was my son. This was my life. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Leo didn't seem to be listening. He just stared at the ground, his wet hair plastered to his forehead. But then, as the deputy finished, he lifted his head and looked directly at us. He looked at Frank. "You should have just let me help you, Dad," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "You should have just signed the papers." There was no remorse, no regret, only the chilling, narcissistic belief that he was the real victim here. That was the moment I knew for certain that the boy I had raised was truly gone, and had been for a very, very long time. They put him in handcuffs. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs locking into place was the final sound, the punctuation mark at the end of a long and terrible story. They put him in the back of a separate patrol car. I watched the taillights recede down our long gravel driveway, taking the last piece of my old life with them. The silence that descended was profound. The flashing lights were turned off, and the world was just the quiet lapping of the lake and the chirping of crickets. The lead deputy came over to us. "You two need to get to the hospital to get checked out," he said gently. "We'll take your full statements there. Are you okay?" I looked at Frank. His face, illuminated by the porch light, was a roadmap of grief and exhaustion. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a sorrow so deep it felt bottomless. But beneath the sorrow there was something else, a glimmer of peace, the relief of a man who has finally unburdened himself of an impossible weight. He reached out and took my hand. His was still cold, but the grip was strong. "We will be," he said, his voice raspy. And as we were led to a warm patrol car, I looked back one last time at the lake. It was calm again, the surface a dark, placid mirror, as if it had already forgotten the terrible truth we had pulled from its depths. The lake forgot, but we couldn't. In the weeks that followed, our quiet life was replaced by a barrage of noise. There were long, grueling hours in sterile rooms at the sheriff's department, telling our story over and over again until the words lost all meaning. There were meetings with prosecutors and child protective services, officials with kind faces and clipboards who asked gentle questions that felt like they were peeling back layers of our skin. Our home, once our fortress, felt like a temporary shelter, a place to catch our breath before the next wave of the legal storm hit. The story of what happened on the lake and what had happened 25 years before became a case file, a docket number, a local news headline. Our private tragedy was now public property. Through it all, Frank and I moved around each other with a careful, quiet courtesy. The chasm of his betrayal was still there, but we were tethered together across it by a shared, grim purpose. We were a team, not of husband and wife, but of two survivors navigating the wreckage. There were no grand speeches of forgiveness, no dramatic tears. Forgiveness felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. There was only the day-to-day work of dismantling a life of lies. We were both exhausted, running on a fuel made of coffee, adrenaline, and the stubborn refusal to completely fall apart. We had to hold it together. We had to do it for them. The children. Our two beautiful, innocent grandchildren, who were now adrift in the foster care system, their world shattered by the two people they had trusted most. One crisp afternoon in late October, when the maple trees along the shore were ablaze in fiery reds and oranges, I was in my garden, pulling up the last of the frost-bitten tomato plants. It was a brutal task, ripping up the withered vines that had given us so much life just a few months before. It felt fitting. I looked up and saw Frank standing in the middle of the lawn, next to the swing set we had built for the kids the summer they were born. It was a sturdy thing made of cedar, with two bright yellow swings hanging still and silent in the autumn air. He wasn't just standing there. He had his toolbox out. He was methodically checking and tightening every bolt, his movements slow and deliberate. He was fixing something that wasn't broken. I walked over, my muddy garden gloves still on. He didn't look up as I approached, just kept turning his wrench with a quiet focus. The rhythmic squeak of the bolt was the only sound between us. The two empty swings swayed slightly in the breeze, waiting for a weight they might never feel again. "The social worker called this morning," I said softly. Frank stopped his work, his hands resting on the frame of the swing set. "And?" he asked, his voice rough. "They're asking about long-term placement, about family. They're asking about us." He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the full, crushing weight of his failure as a father. It was a wound that would never truly heal. But I also saw something else, something I hadn't seen since before Ethan died, a flicker of fierce, protective light. "For 25 years, he said, his voice thick with a regret that was so profound it was almost a physical presence, I thought I was protecting my family. I thought I was saving my son." He shook his head, a gesture of self-loathing. "But I was just a coward. I was protecting a secret, not a person. I was saving myself from the pain of the truth." He looked from my face to the empty swings, and his gaze hardened with a new resolve. "My real job protecting our family's honor, protecting them starts now. Whatever it takes, Sarah, we have to bring those kids home. We owe it to them. We owe it to Ethan." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in a quarter of a century. It wasn't an apology. It was a vow, atonement. In that moment, standing under the fiery autumn trees, I felt the first, tentative shift in the frozen landscape of my heart. I reached out and placed my hand over his on the wooden frame. His skin was rough, calloused, familiar. "I know, Frank," I said. "I know. We stood there for a long time, two old, broken people deciding to build something new from the rubble." Later that evening, he came to me as I was reading in the living room. "Come with me," he said. He led me not to the workshop, but to the boathouse. He pulled the heavy sliding door open, and we stepped into the cool, shadowed space. It smelled of lake water and old wood. And there it was, hanging above us, Ethan's kayak. A beautiful, lonely ghost. "It's been a memorial long enough," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's time for it to be a boat again." He dragged a ladder over. "Help me," he said. Together, we unhooked the heavy straps, and with a series of coordinated, careful movements, we lowered the kayak from the rafters. It was the first time it had touched the ground in 25 years. It settled onto the sawhorses with a soft, woody sigh. Frank ran his hand along the smooth, curved deck, his touch full of a gentle reverence. "The varnish is getting thin in a few spots," he said, his voice more to himself than to me. "I'm going to sand it all down, give it a few new coats, make it strong again." He looked at me, his eyes shining in the dim light. "For them," he said, "for the kids. When they're old enough, I'll teach them how to paddle. I'll teach them what their Uncle Ethan taught me." He was transforming our shrine of grief into a vessel of hope. He was taking the most painful symbol of our past and turning it into a promise for the future. I reached out and placed my hand next to his on the worn cedar deck. Under our hands, the boat wasn't just a collection of wood and glue and memories, it was a legacy. And for the first time, I knew with a deep and certain conviction that it was one worth saving.